It was October 1943. A German infantry sergeant crouched in a farmhouse cellar outside Cassino, listening to a sound he had never heard before. It was not the low, familiar drone of Luftwaffe transports or the tight mechanical whine of Stuka dive bombers. This was something different, something that seemed to fill the entire sky, a deep, continuous thunder that grew louder for minutes before it was directly overhead, and then kept growing louder still, until the stone walls of the cellar trembled and dust fell from the ceiling in slow curtains. He pressed it.
Survived the encirclement, the counter-encirclement, the collapse of Army Group South. He had held positions through Soviet artillery barrages that turned the ground into a lunar landscape. But when the American bombers passed that night, he later told a British interrogator, he understood for the first time that this was a different kind of war entirely. Not a war of armies, but a war of factories. There were, he said, simply too many of them. Not 1 or 2 or 10. Hundreds. And they were flying so high and so steadily that nothing on the ground could touch them. He sat in that cellar and listened until the sound faded, and then he sat for a long time afterward in silence. The British interrogator who recorded this account in November 1943 noted at the bottom of his report that the sergeant's
The statement was consistent with dozens of similar accounts collected from German prisoners captured across the Italian front over the preceding weeks. They all described the same thing, the sound, and what the sound meant. This is the story of what the American strategic bombing campaign looked like from the German side of the war. Not the side reported in mission debriefs and press releases, but the side recorded in classified interrogation transcripts, secretly bugged conversations at Trent Park and Fort Hunt, and the private correspondence of German officers who never expected anyone to read it. It is a story about what happens when an industrial civilization decides to wage war, and what that looks like to soldiers who were told it could not be done. The German High Command had spent years constructing a picture of American military capability that was almost entirely wrong. The picture was not built from intelligence failures alone. It was built from ideology. Hitler had said America was a racial mongrel nation, soft, divided, incapable of sustained sacrifice. Hermann Göring had dismissed American aircraft production estimates as fantasy when Roosevelt announced in 1940 that the United States would build 50,000 planes a year. Albert Speer, who would later become the architect of Germany's own industrial war machine, admitted in his post-war memoirs that German planners never seriously modeled what full American industrial mobilization would look like. They had looked at the numbers Roosevelt announced and simply decided not to believe them. This was not stupidity. It was the kind of error that ideology makes inevitable, because ideology replaces analysis with certainty. The certainty, in this case, was that America was weak.
And by the time the certainty was proven wrong, it was far too late to correct the planning that had been built upon it. The 8th Air Force began operations from England in August 1942 with 327 combat aircraft and a doctrine that its commanders believed would change the nature of war. The doctrine was called precision daylight bombing. American planners had concluded, based on years of theoretical study and a handful of pre-war experiments, that modern bomb sites, specifically the Norden bomb site, could deliver bombs with enough accuracy to destroy industrial targets without the need for nighttime area bombing. The British had already abandoned daylight bombing after suffering catastrophic losses in 1939 and 1940. Their bomber command operated almost entirely at night, dropping bombs across wide target areas because precision was impossible in darkness. The Americans disagreed. They believed that high-altitude daylight formations of heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses could fight their way through German defenses and hit specific targets.
The theory was wrong in almost every particular that mattered, and it cost thousands of American lives to discover how wrong it was. But the process of discovering it and the industrial scale at which the Americans kept trying despite the losses revealed something to German commanders that no propaganda could explain away. In August and September of 1942, 8th Air Force flew its first combat missions against targets in occupied France. The raids were small, cautious, and carefully chosen to avoid the most heavily defended areas of the Reich. German fighter commanders assessed the American formations with professional interest. The B-17 was well armed, they noted, more so than British bombers. Its defensive fire was dangerous. But the formations were small enough to overwhelm, and German fighters were already developing tactics to attack from the front, where the bombers were most vulnerable. The assessments were shared through the Luftwaffe command structure with calm confidence. The American formations could be managed. Then, the American formations got larger. By the time the 8th Air Force launched its first attacks on targets inside Germany in January 1943, German fighter pilots were encountering formations of 60 to 80 heavy bombers. By the summer of 1943, raids of 200.
Aircraft were not uncommon. By early 1944, the Americans were sending 500, and then 700, and then over 1,000 bombers in a single day's operation. The numbers were so far beyond anything German planners had modeled that senior Luftwaffe officers initially refused to believe the figures reported by their own fighter controllers. Colonel Hannes Trautloft, one of Germany's leading fighter commanders, wrote in his operational diary in July 1943 that the sheer scale of American formations had begun to produce a psychological effect on his pilots that pure tactics could not counter. It was not that the bombers were invulnerable, he wrote. Individual aircraft could be shot down. Skilled pilots could find ways into the formations. But the formations did not stop. You shot down 3 and 17 were still flying toward the target. You shot down 20 and the rest kept coming. The attrition, Trautloft observed, was on the side of the Americans. The specific mathematics of this attrition became visible in the secret recordings made at Trent Park during 1943 and 1944. Captured Luftwaffe officers, believing their conversations were private, spoke with unusual candor about what the air war was costing Germany.
Transcripts preserved in the British National Archives record a November 1943 conversation between 2 captured German fighter pilots who had each flown more than 150 combat missions on the Eastern and Western fronts. One of them, whose name appears in the transcript only by rank as an Oberlieutenant, described a raid he had intercepted the previous month. There were, he said, more than 400 of them. We had perhaps 80 fighters available by the time we could concentrate. We shot down 14. They lost maybe 20 to weather and accidents and flak, but they hit the target. And the next week, they came back, and the week after that. His companion was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had been told by his commanding officer that Germany had to shoot down 500 American aircraft per month just to maintain the current ratio of attrition. His commanding officer had also told him this was impossible. The conversation was transcribed, classified, and filed. It remained classified for more than 50 years. When historians gained access to the Trent Park archive in the early 2000s, following the research of German historian Sönke Neitzel, they found hundreds of conversations with similar themes. German officers speaking to each other with a frankness they would never have used in official channels. And revealing through that frankness what the official channels carefully concealed. The Schweinfurt raids of October 1943 became the most discussed engagement of the early air war, both because of what they cost the Americans and because of what they revealed about the limits of the German defense. On October 14th, 291 B-17s were dispatched to attack the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. The 8th Air Force lost 60 aircraft that day, nearly 600 men killed, captured, or missing, and another 17 bombers so badly damaged that they never flew again. It was the worst single-day loss in American strategic bombing history. German propaganda celebrated it as proof that American daylight bombing was impossible. But the Germans who had actually fought the battle were more cautious in their private assessments. The fighter pilots knew that they had inflicted maximum damage and still not stopped the raid. The factory at Schweinfurt was hit, production was disrupted, and within a month, American formations were back over Germany. The losses that had seemed so devastating to American planners were losses that American industry could replace in weeks. The Luftwaffe pilots who had inflicted those losses could not be replaced nearly so quickly. A German fighter pilot required 18 months to 2 years of training before he was combat ready. An American B-17 crew required approximately 12 months. American factories were churning out trained aircrew faster than German factories were churning out the planes to fight them. This asymmetry, invisible in the raw casualty numbers, determined the outcome of the air war before most German commanders recognized it was happening. When the Mustang arrived, German pilots recognized it at once as something different. The P-51 Mustang,
equipped with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and carrying external fuel tanks that could be dropped when combat began, could escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and fight German interceptors on something approaching equal terms. The first escort missions to Berlin in March 1944 shocked Luftwaffe command. Fighter pilots who had been shooting down American bombers with confidence for 18 months now found themselves intercepted by American fighters hundreds of miles inside German territory. General Adolf Galland, Germany's general of fighters and one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced commanders, told Albert Speer in a private meeting in early 1944 that the appearance of American fighters over Berlin was a turning point from which the German air defense could not recover. He had been saying for months that the Luftwaffe needed better aircraft and more time to produce them. The Mustang told him that time had run out. The effect on German ground forces was cumulative and then catastrophic. By the spring of 1944, German supply convoys moving by road in Western Europe had adapted their entire operational rhythm around the American air threat. Movement in daylight was, for practical purposes, impossible. A column of trucks on an open road was a target that American fighter bombers could not resist, and the pilots of the 9th Air Force's tactical units had learned to range hundreds of miles looking for exactly such targets. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that flew these missions could carry bombs, rockets, and machine gun ammunition enough to destroy most of a convoy in a single pass. German logistics officers learned to route convoys through forests where the canopy provided some concealment, to move at night even when night movement was operationally inefficient, to disperse supplies across dozens of small stockpiles rather than concentrating them in depots that might attract attention. The dispersion that American air power forced on German logistics added days to every supply cycle and created shortages that no amount of rationing could ever overcome.
Tactical ingenuity could compensate. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been transferred to France to command Army Group B in preparation for the expected Allied invasion, wrote in his private papers during the spring of 1944 that the air situation had already determined the outcome of the coming battle before it began. Rommel was one of the few German commanders willing to state this kind of conclusion in writing because he understood at a visceral level what it meant to fight without air cover. He had learned it in North Africa, where Allied air power had made daylight operations suicidal long before the ground campaign was decided. Now, he was watching the same dynamic develop in France on an even larger scale. He wrote that any reserves Germany committed to the battle after the Allied landings would have to move by night and in small groups, and that this would make it impossible to concentrate force at the decisive point before the Allies had consolidated their beachhead. He was describing, with the precision of a man who had spent years thinking about mobile warfare, exactly why Germany would lose the Battle of Normandy before it started. His prediction was correct in almost every detail. When the Allied landings came on June 6, 1944, German panzer divisions that could have counterattacked the beachhead in the first critical hours instead spent days crawling toward the front in small groups at night, their movement disrupted by air attacks, fuel shortages caused by destroyed supply lines, and the constant need to disperse whenever Allied aircraft appeared overhead. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, ordered to march from its base near Toulouse in southern France to the Normandy front, covered a distance that should have taken 2 days in 2 weeks. The division arrived at the front depleted, disorganized, and having committed atrocities against French civilians in its frustration,
including the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane.
before it ever engaged the forces it had been sent to stop. The secret recordings made during this period captured German officers processing in real time what was happening to their army. A Trent Park conversation from late June 1944 between a captured Waffen-SS colonel and a Wehrmacht infantry general records the general describing a drive he had made from Paris to the front. It had taken him 3 days to travel 200 kilometers. He had moved only at night. He had watched, from a concealed position in a forest, a column of supply trucks destroyed in less than 10 minutes by a single American fighter bomber that appeared without warning from the south. He counted the burning trucks afterward. There were 11. The pilot had not been aiming at individual targets, the general noted. He had simply flown down the length of the column and fired. The accuracy was almost irrelevant. At the density of the road traffic, anything that moved was hit. The SS colonel who listened to this account said nothing for a long time. Then he said that in 4 years of fighting on the Eastern Front, he had never felt what he felt in France, which was that the enemy owned the air the way you owned a room. You could move around in a room you owned. In a room someone else owned, you were always crouching. This metaphor, preserved in a conceded. German soldiers fighting in France in the summer of 1944 lived in a kind of permanent crouch. The American strategic bombing campaign that had been designed to destroy German industrial capacity was producing a second effect that planners had not fully anticipated. It was destroying German tactical mobility on a scale that altered the outcome of every engagement on the ground. The numbers that sustained all of this were, from the German perspective, simply incomprehensible. In 1944, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft. Germany produced 39,000, and German production was declining as factories were bombed, raw materials became scarcer, and the workforce was increasingly diverted to defense. American factories were not declining. They were accelerating. The bomber crews who flew the missions knew almost nothing of these numbers. They knew their specific target for the day's mission. They knew the route they would fly and the altitude they would maintain. They knew which other aircraft were in their formation and what they were supposed to do if they lost an engine or took a hit to their hydraulics. They were very young, most of them, 20 or 21 years old, and they sat in freezing aluminum tubes at altitudes where the temperature outside was 40 below zero and tried to do their jobs correctly. Many of them did not come back. Over the course of the war, the 8th Air Force lost approximately 26,000 men killed in action and another 28,000 taken prisoner. The casualty rate among bomber crews in the worst periods of 1943 meant that a crew member's statistical chance of completing a standard 25-mission tour was below 25%. These were not odds that encouraged long-term planning. And yet, the missions continued. And yet the factories kept sending more aircraft. And yet the formations that appeared over Germany kept getting larger. The sergeant in the cellar outside Cassino, listening to the sound of the American bombers in October 1943, understood something that night that his generals were still refusing to acknowledge in their briefing rooms. The sound he heard was not the sound of aircraft. It was the sound of factories. Thousands of factories, running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, converting the raw materials of an entire continent into the specific geometry of war. The sound had been building for months in American plants, in Seattle and Wichita and Marietta and Long Beach, in the design offices of Boeing and Consolidated and North American and Lockheed, in the training fields of Texas and Nebraska, where young men learned to fly at night, in the mathematics departments of universities, where engineers calculated the load tolerances of wings and the oxygen requirements of men at 30,000 feet. All of that, the work of millions of people over months and years, converged into the sound he heard in that cellar. He pressed his palms against the floor and listened to it, and he knew, in the specific way that soldiers know things before their commanders admit them, that the war was already over. The rest of it, the fighting that would continue for another year and a half, was just the sound of the conclusion being reached.
That is what German soldiers said in captured conversations and interrogation transcripts and private letters that were steamed open by intelligence officers in London and Washington. Not in the way that propaganda says things, with slogans and certainty, but in the way that exhausted men say true things to each other when they believe no one is listening. They said the Americans had too many. They said there was no answer to the sky. They said the war against the factories was a war that could not be won because the factories were too far away and too numerous and too productive, and behind them was an entire